So I have the fun and somewhat unenviable task tonight of teaching you everything there is to know about the Jewish calendar in one evening. It is an impossible chore, and I will not succeed, but I will do my best. And when I say I won't necessarily succeed is in putting it together. I realize the amount of information here that I have to cram into everybody's head is like trying to get 5 gallons of water in a 1 gallon tank. It's just going to spill over everywhere. But it is an introductory class, so there's only so much we can do, and I can't make it perfect, but I will. You'll at least have heard many things tonight about the calendar. But before we start with the calendar itself and the holidays, let's talk in general about Jewish time. Jewish time is a very special part of Jewish culture. And aside from really just maybe one community that I can think of, which would be the Ethiopian Jewish community, the Jewish calendar has been standardized for the whole Jewish world since, well, not quite 2,000 years ago. They were still arguing about it, but since about 1700 years ago. So we are all familiar with the basics. We have a 7-day week. We don't know exactly where that came from. There are some new theories I'm looking at, but if there is really a unique contribution that the Jews might have made to the world, that 7-day week, at least as it stuck, might have been one of them. But it's hard to say that for certain. Our days begin at sunset, which is the most imprecise time that you could possibly come up with, because it creates a lot of overlap. When is sunset exactly? Well, that's determined by looking up in the sky and all different kinds of things that you can do with mathematic formulations that I am no good at, which is why I rely, like everybody else in the Jewish world, on these preset and predetermined calendars. Jewish days end at not sunset, but sundown, which in the Talmud is generally described as the time when 3 stars appear in the sky. So you can already get the notion here that there's going to be that overlap. And as we talk about Shabbat in a moment, you'll see what I'm talking about. Our year is not quite a solar year, but nor is it quite a lunar year. So certainly the months are lunar months. So they are based upon the cycles of the moon, which are roughly 28 plus days, but not exactly. And you'll always know roughly the date when you see a full moon, that it's the 15th day or the 14th day of the lunar month. And then as it begins to wax and disappear, you're counting the days down to the next month. And then with the reappearance of a new moon, all of this used to be done visually and not in any kind of way with an algorithm or something like that. But when you see the reappearance of the new moon, you know that Rosh Chodesh, the minor holiday that's no longer really observed, it's been described as a holiday that at one point was very focused on women in the community. We don't have a ton of evidence of that, but there's a few texts on that. But Rosh Chodesh does have some implications in terms of dating the holidays, when they're going to fall. And if all of this was being done by people looking up in the sky, then you can pretty much imagine to yourself that there would be from time to time controversy about when a month begins or when it ends. And indeed there was. There are famous stories, not just in the Talmud, but in the Mishnah itself. There's famous stories about when did the month actually begin, and rabbis arguing with each other. And finally, we get the whole of the Jewish year, which is, well, I'm sorry, I forgot to backtrack. That's the lunar part. I forgot the solar part. So you're probably familiar with, even just by being alive and having exposure to the media, even if you don't know a lot about Islam, you're probably familiar with the fact that Ramadan, for instance, which is a whole lunar month of the Muslim calendar, rotates around the calendar, right? It drifts. Well, the reason it drifts, of course, is because the lunar cycle and the solar cycle are not synced to each other. Each of them is doing their own thing. We're going around the sun at a very different rate than the moon is going around us. Now, while there are roughly 12 of those cycles per trip around the sun, it's not exactly. And so what happens is that the months tend to drift backwards in time, or against the lunar months begin to drift backwards in time against the solar calendar, a little by a little every year. So if you've heard the saying that Jewish holidays are never on time, they're always early or late, that's why. There does seem to be kind of a sweet spot. I think we just hit it last year. One of the few positive things about this past Jewish cycle. And what happens is, of course, that you'll wind up without a correction having spring holidays fall back to the fall and fall holidays in the spring. And that doesn't matter much on the Muslim calendar because it's a liturgical calendar alone. But it matters a great deal on the Jewish calendar, which was not originally a liturgical calendar, but which was a calendar by which people set the agricultural schedule. When were the harvests? When were the gleanings? All those kinds of things. When did you sow? When did you reap? So in order to adjust for this, the rabbis created a system of leap years. So we've got leap years in our regular Gregorian calendar, but those are to fix a well-known phenomenon in the solar year, that it's not really 365 days to make your trip around the sun. It's 365 days and a quarter. So every 4 years you adjust for your quarter. Well, in the Luni, and it is Luni, but it's not spelled that like that, it's Luni, in the Luni-solar calendar, you have to adjust it differently. And so 7 times in every 19-year period, according to a mathematical formula that is well beyond my understanding, we throw in an additional month. And the month shoots everything forward again. So I haven't even checked the calendar, but I am pretty sure, based upon when Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur come next year, because that's the first date every rabbi ever looks at on any calendar, that with it coming very close to Labor Day and it never having been before Labor Day, that we're going to stick in, as JB just chatted through, we're going to stick in an extra month. I bet next year. I could be wrong, but I bet we're sticking an extra month. And when we do stick in the extra month, it comes in the spring, and it's called an extra Adar. You're right, Rin, and I'm speaking, this is what happens when I start doing math. It's this year. That was when the Adar 2 was, because we got early and now we have to shove it forward. Okay, anyway, I'm not gonna do any more math because I always goof it up, and we're just gonna go to the stuff I'm better at. I remember once when I was a Hillel director at the University of Illinois, we had computer scientists who were part of the Orthodox Minyan, and they could work these algorithms out in their head. And the discussions they had, the minute discussions that they had about when things should fall and how they should fall, were just beyond me. So I probably make a mistake even bringing it up. But you have to know there are these leap months. There is this lunar solar calendar. This was disputed over time. There were, for instance, the Essenes, who were the Dead Sea Scrolls group, the Dead Sea Scrolls cult. They operated on an entirely solar calendar. And so they had completely different dates for everything. And they were following months that had nothing to do with what the rest of the Jewish world was. Talk about a split, a schism. All right, so much for the overview of the Jewish year. Let me just share a picture of what it would look like, what it does look like. There, you can probably see that, right? And here you see how they line up. I tried to find something simple, and it also, as a result, was kind of childish. But here are the Hebrew months going around the Gregorian months, and you see the rough matchup. Now, you also might notice here, and I hope you can read it, I tried to get a high-res copy here, that there are circles that I'm circling these numbers here. And why am I circling the numbers? To show you what month we're in. Now, if you look down here, you see a shofar, and you see an apple, and also the stuff for Sukkot here. But the apple and the shofar are supposed to introduce to us to, or supposed to represent Rosh Hashanah, right? The head of the year. That's what it means. So why then do we have, and I realize it's upside down, why then do we have a 7 here? Well, Rosh Hashanah is actually the 7th month of the year. The Torah doesn't give us the years, but it does tell us that the Exodus took place in the month called Aviv, which is spring, and that it was the first month of the year. Nisan is that month today. These are largely Babylonian names. Nisan is that month today, and it is actually the first month of the year. Tishrei, the 7th month, when we celebrate the new year, is more like, and those who have heard me in Sunday schools over the years know what I'll say, it's the birthday of the world. And it really is celebrated as the birthday of the world. God, for whatever reason that the rabbis discuss in different midrash, different lore, and other kinds of documents that they had over the years, God chose to create the world in the 7th month. So if you find yourself getting confused, what's the first month, what's the 7th month, etc., there's good reason for that. And the reason is that even if we look back at extra biblical evidence, we've never had, in all of Israelite, Hebrew, Jewish, whatever you want to call it, history, we never had in the ancient times one singular calendar. It seems that over different periods of ancient history, there were different calendars, that some Jews followed solar calendars, some Jews followed lunar calendars, that there were compromises that were made, that there were overlays. This calendar here, with these names in particular, seems to be a remnant of Babylonian exile. Okay, so much for the overview and the seasons. I think you guys obviously know Nisan is in the spring, that's when Passover is, and Tishrei in the fall. All right, so let's step away from the calendar for just a minute and talk not about the holidays that are on the calendar, but the holiday that's on every single week of the calendar, Shabbat. Shabbat. So why do we celebrate Shabbat according to the tradition? Why do we celebrate it according to history? I can answer the second question much more easily because, again, we're not entirely sure. We do not have any kind of good history of other peoples celebrating a 7th-day Sabbath, much less a 7-day week. The weeks are completely arbitrary in stating that they're 7. Different cultures have had different lengths of weeks. And so the Sabbath, Shabbat, is going to fall under the same kind of thing. But the story that the Torah tells us is that, and we sing this in the, well, traditional Jews sing this. If you've ever heard the Kiddush, the Kiddush, by the way, not a prayer over wine, it's a prayer over Shabbat. The wine is a prop. It's to give you something physical to do. If you don't have the wine, you still have to say the Kiddush. And on Friday night, they start the Kiddush out with the verses from the end of the first chapter, beginning of the second chapter of Genesis. The heaven and the earth were finished in all their array. On the 7th day, God finished the work that he had been doing, and he ceased on the 7th day from all the work he had done. And he blessed the 7th day and declared it holy, because on it he ceased from all the work of creation that he had done. Which raises a lot of interesting questions about, is making Shabbat also creating something that didn't exist before? But I won't take you down that rabbit hole. Just an example of some of the kinds of things that they'll ask in the Talmud. Another reason given for the observance of Shabbat, though, and we find this in the various prayers, and also it's mentioned in the Torah, quoting from these prayers, is as a memorial to God's act of rescuing the Israelites from slavery in Egypt from their bondage. And in the Kiddush itself, that prayer itself, those of you who have heard it, you may recognize this part. Zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim, remembrance of the going out of Egypt. So that's given prominence there as well. But in fact, I think it has much more to do with the deity resting on that day, and that was sort of a later add-on in terms of an excuse given for doing it. So what do Jews do on this weekly holiday? Well, ideally, the holiday begins, every Shabbat is a holiday, this holiday begins at sunset. In traditional Judaism, women are exempted from a lot of time-bound commandments. So they don't have to pray at X hour or Y hour the way men do. They have to pray, but not at those specific times. But the one piece of time-bound ritual that they are obligated to is lighting those candles on Friday night. Typically, though not universally, they are kindled about 18 minutes before sunset. That's a rough estimate. Whenever they're kindled, women take upon themselves Shabbat. So I know my daughter likes to push it to as far as she could, as late as she could, in order to without dismissing Shabbat or violating Shabbat, I should say. And once that happens, it is Shabbat, at least for her. And once it's sundown, which is just a few minutes later, or sunset, it's Shabbat for everyone in the house. And the rituals begin. People don't cook on Shabbat for reasons that I'll talk about in a moment, but they begin with a beautiful ceremony at home over the meal. If there is synagogue included on a Friday night in traditional communities, it tends to be the men going. Now, this totally got turned on its head in America. In America, where we had a 6-day work week, and for many people, a 7-day work week, it became very important to particularly the Reform movement, which had been experiencing some pressures to move the whole service and Sabbath over to a Sunday, which they never did. But it became particularly important for them to find a time when people would come to synagogue. And so as long ago as the late 1800s, and then with big pushes, including in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the late Friday night service was created. The Friday night service that begins at 8 o'clock in many communities. And we don't see those as often or as frequently in the Reform world anymore, but that's where that came from. But traditionally, many men did not go to synagogue on Friday night. It's a very short service. It doesn't really merit the big trip to synagogue unless you're saying Kaddish or what have you. And you may remember from Fiddler on the Roof, always a good reference point for people, that he's saying his evening Shabbat prayers as Gold is chasing him around the room trying to deal with issues that she needs to talk about. So that's not actually such an irresponsible portrayal. It's pretty close on what people do. The ritual around the table, I won't go into in any detail, but it includes the challah. Some people have 2 challahs to represent some ancient lore about receiving 2 portions of the manna when they were traveling in the wilderness. And of course, the wine, which is meant to be a gladdening, it's Jewish approved alcohol. Partaking in alcohol, or I suppose alcohol abuse, if you go by some of the Chabad houses that I was privy to when I was both a student and a Hillel director, and watched them not only schlepping wine for those kids all the time, but also vodka and everything else that they could get away with. It definitely helped build their attendance. And then the evening going into the next day is one of leisure. Certainly the synagogue on Saturday morning is a big focus for communities. But having lived in and adjacent to traditional communities, as well as Reform and conservative and secular communities, it's not always the big attraction you think it is, which is why they often do what even I do, have special speakers or special Shabbat experiences or things like that to draw people in. But as synagogue services go, it is the top one of the week. And it means that that's when you're going to read the entire Torah portion that's assigned to that week. It's assigned in weekly apportionments that we read the Torah in traditional settings. And then people, depending on their degree of observance, will do anything from rest and relax the rest of the afternoon, engage in Torah study, nap. Napping is big, very big, until it's dark in the sky and you don't have to go out and spot the 3 stars. They are right there for you in every book. Every community has a book of times that comes out every year. It's always the same. I have it on my smartphone because I always want to know when Shabbat's over for my family. And I have it set to Baltimore, so I know when it's safe that I can text or call or what have you. And we end that Shabbat, the Sabbath, with a service called, and it's just a little home service called Havdalah or Havdalah, which simply means separation. Some reform conservative, and certainly we do it as well, more reform and humanistic, we'll push it a little bit earlier, or maybe do it as part of an afternoon service for B'nai Mitzvah, etc. But that's really done in the home with a beautiful braided candle, which represents the days of the week, and some wine, although you can use other things, and a spice box where you capture the sweetness of the smell of Shabbat. And it's a very short and beautiful ceremony. And then you can go watch TV or get pizza or whatever it is you were planning to do. But of course, what I've described in terms of all the beautiful things of Shabbat is only a little bit of Shabbat. The other part of Shabbat that rabbinical Jewish laws bring us are all of the restrictions on Shabbat. Sometimes I peek over at the Facebook Humanistic Judaism discussion group, and I see some of the wildest discussions going on there about why this, why that, and the other. I would encourage everybody to remember, this is not science. Even if they are sometimes invoking sciencey sounding reasons for things, religion does not base itself on science and doesn't hold together because of science. So there's nothing science in this. And I mention that particularly because one of the main prohibitions is the prohibition on creating or tending to a fire. And as you probably know, in the 20th century, early on, for many Orthodox Jews, that became associated with initiating electricity, not using electricity. I don't know any Orthodox Jews who don't use electricity, but they have them on timers and this and that. Or they keep the oven on and they don't usually open the oven door, or they keep the refrigerator on, obviously, even if they unscrew a light bulb so the light isn't being turned on and off by them all day long. Never mind the fact that the burden on it does create more work for the refrigerating unit and so forth, but that's my point. You're not going to get to science through any of this. What we have in this is instead a whole series of customs aimed to sort of, to the best of their ability, do what the Torah says and still live life. I mentioned early in our wanderings class about the Karaites, these Jews who went strictly by biblical commandments. And they were determined not to have any fire in their home at all. It's a wonder that in Europe, and in fact, they're very uncommon in Europe, that they just didn't freeze to death because they had no fire. Now, in most communities in Europe and so forth, where you had to have fire, they figured out a way to have a timer. And I won't explain exactly how it goes, but the term, it's inelegant, but it is the term that was used, was a Shabbos Goy. In other words, a Gentile who would come over on Shabbat and tend to your fire. Now, there were all kinds of rules about how this person could be employed, and they're not permitted anymore because of automation. But even back then, they figured it out. You can keep a fire going if it's fed by gas, as long as it's not an open flame that you would be tempted to mess with. Fire becomes a really big one because it's explicitly mentioned in the Torah not to tend to or deal with fire on Shabbat. But there are also many, many other restrictions. One is gathering. That's explicitly mentioned in the Torah. And we know that after some Jews, some Hebrews went out to gather the manna when they received extra on Friday and should not have needed to collect it on Saturday, but Yahweh being, I don't know, perhaps he put it on automation himself, went ahead and sent some on Saturday, and some Jews collected it, and some Jews died on account of that. It was considered a capital crime. Okay, so those are really among the very few specifically forbidden tasks. So how do we get to these hundreds of others? Well, here's where the rabbis, and this is why this is under the laws, this is where the rabbis invent or claim to have received through the oral law that we discussed several weeks ago, the exact procedure for determining what is permitted on Shabbat or not. They played, based upon one of their 13 rules of interpretation, a very interesting little legal trick, if you will. Remember those 13 rules that they sort of went back and retroactively created by interpreting all of the different things that had been interpreted using language games and situational coincidences and all kinds of things? Well, they did that here too. And here they did it big time. They noted, for instance, that in Exodus 31, we have page after page after page after page, or scroll after scroll, if you were them, of instructions for how to build the tabernacle. The tabernacle was the portable temple that they walked around with in the wilderness. So it looks like the temple, but smaller, and you can dismantle it easily. And page after page after page after page of that, when that incredibly boring section finally ends, the next thing we get to is something about Shabbat. And the rabbi said, oh, one of our rules is that the Torah doesn't put anything near something else unless there's a message. And so they said, here's the message. We don't know what the hell to do on Shabbat. Let's look at what they had to do to build and maintain the tabernacle. And we will extrapolate from that the things we can't do on Shabbat. Isn't that a great idea, everybody? And that's exactly what they did. Sometimes when I used to teach this in more depth, I had a great children's book. Every page had one of these 39, count them, 39 broad bases of, or umbrella rules that you could then stick other things underneath. It's so complicated that to go beyond this for you would be a complete waste of your time tonight. But I will tell you that they are called the 39 milachot, and that milacha is one of the words for labor, chiefly the one that we're supposed to avoid for traditional Jews on Shabbat. And it's not the same thing as work or toil. It seems to be more related perhaps to creative work. That is, after all, what they were doing with the tabernacle. Be that as it may, you can try to systematize this with your own periodic table of Torah Shabbat elements all you want. You will find that this is much more art than science. But nevertheless, it's art that keeps people together. And one of the strengths of traditional rabbinical Judaism in this regard is that it really does keep people together. Believe me, there are plenty of Orthodox Jews that I know who question the common sense or lack thereof of a lot of these rules. It doesn't matter. This is what they do. I don't think they help themselves by trying, even in the 21st century, to explain how turning on a light switch is creating a fire when every scientist will tell you it's not. But again, I'm going to leave that alone. It's not I don't have a dog in that fight. Okay, so I did this exactly on time. So now I got through the first half hour, and we're gonna switch gears, and we're gonna take a look at the various holidays. So there are two ways to do this, and I'm gonna try to do them in both ways, do it in both ways. One is to talk about the types of holidays and observances, and the other is to, so in other words, to categorize them more or less by type. And the other is to show them to you in chronological order. So I've decided to go ahead and first present them to you in chronological order, because I am certain that most of you will have instant recognition of a lot of this. And that way we can go back to discussing them by type, and it will be maybe a little bit easier. But I'm going to go ahead and leave this on the screen so that you'll have it to reference. This is the document that I was thinking I could maybe put into the whatever, the share document thing. Okay, you guys can see this, okay, right? All right, I only see a few of your faces now, as is the way with this particular, let me see if I can see a few more faces. There we go. So these are the holidays in chronological order, beginning with the 7th month. Remember again that Tishrei, which is when Rosh Hashanah falls, is the 7th month. And I also have them marked as the typology that I'm going to be mentioning as we go through them. And maybe I'll keep this on the screen and bounce back and forth just so you can see where they are in the year. But you're undoubtedly familiar with this. The 1st through the 2nd of Tishrei which is in the autumn, roughly September, going into the month, roughly September, going into October, depending upon the year. That is the beginning of the year, and it begins a 10-day period that culminates on the 10th of Tishrei with Yom Kippur. These are the two high holidays called in Hebrew the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, the awesome days. And they are the most observed days still on the Jewish calendar, although I think Pesach in America may be slowly overtaking it. Certainly Rosh Hashanah, certainly Yom Kippur, I should say. But they're the big synagogue days. These are the days when public pronunciations are the most important. When we get to the typologies, I'll tell you a little bit more about their content. Not a lot, but as much as I can. And these are both, our high holidays. Yom Kippur is also one of two major fast days. So we have two major fast days and two high holidays represented here. This month, Tishrei, is the best illustration that I can give you of the history of these holidays, because had they been designed by, I don't care, by a deity or a person with a 12th grade education, they would not look like this. Because no sooner are you finished with this intense 10-day period that 5 days later you land in this one, Sukkot. And Sukkot is not just one holiday. It's 7 days of one holiday. It's another day of another holiday. It's another day of that other holiday in a changed format, depending upon when you live and how it's observed. And here we're getting into things so complicated that is it any wonder that people can't understand it anymore? And you have to read whole books about this. Unless you grow up with it, it can be really, really daunting. It's not hard to remember, though, that Sukkot is a pilgrimage holiday, of which we have three. But even within those three pilgrimage holidays, we have varieties, variations. We have two that expand over several days. That would be Passover and Sukkot. We have one that actually has as its terminus another holiday altogether, the Shmini Atzeret, which means the 8th day of assembly. This particular one also has another identity, Simchat Torah, the rejoicing in the Torah. If these three that I'm highlighting here all come from different eras of evolution and were introduced at different times, this one alone, you can see, contains elements of either older or newer or other, in some cases we know, like Simchat Torah, holidays and observances that have been combined and moved around even within the last 1500 to 1800 years, which in Jewish history is not that long ago when we talk about the formation of holidays. Sukkot is the one with the sukkahs. I'll talk in more detail about it in a moment. Then we get to our first minor holiday of our year. And by the way, I meant to mention that the years are numbered on the basis of how old people thought the earth was. And that was determined not by science, but by counting up the days and years in the Bible. So that's where Christians get this idea of 6,000 years. For Jews, right now we're in the year 5781. So it's approximately 6,000. But again, if it's the birthday, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't have to start in the first month. We're used to that because our Gregorian calendar, we renumber when we hit the first month. But your personal calendar, which is your birth date, you renumber no matter what month it falls in. So that logic is there for any birthday. Anyway, on this holiday cycle, if we begin it in the fall, our first minor holiday we just finished. That's Hanukkah. Very recent, and I'll talk more about it in just a few moments, just a few words about each of these holidays. The next time we have a holiday will be on the 15th of Shvat. It's midwinter. It's actually going to be around the last week of January this year. And it is a commemoration, not a holiday really, called Tu B'Shvat. And Tu B'Shvat simply means 15th day of Shvat. More on that in a minute too. Rounding into spring, the last holiday that we got to celebrate in person, believe it or not, at our temple was Purim. We always have a lot of fun on Purim. We had a great crowd. We knew COVID was coming, but we still celebrated because it hadn't come anywhere near Michigan yet, and we were still 2.5 weeks to 3 weeks away from our first reported case. But I have now these memories, and I think this year Purim's going to be virtual, and it's not such a great virtual holiday. So we'll see what happens with it. But this is the one that celebrates the events of the book of Esther and Queen Esther and all of that. We get into the next pilgrimage holiday. Number one, really, if you're counting it from the beginning of the year, because remember, Nisan is the first month of the year, but really number two on our psychological clock, which always begins in the fall. And that's Pesach, one of the few holidays we really do call in English something here in America, Passover. It begins a period called the Omer. The Omer was a traditionally bringing of sheaves of wheat to count down to the next pilgrimage festival. It transformed over the years, and that's way too complicated to explain, but you can see a little bit of transformation in the modern period because many Jews today will observe two very recent commemorations that take place during this period of Omer that falls between the second day of Passover and Shavuot, our next holiday on the cycle. And what are those two? Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Remembrance Day, which was declared a day of remembrance by the Israeli Knesset. So not a bunch of rabbis involved this time. Created a bunch of controversy because it kind of contradicts some of what the Omer period came to be. And then finally, second, we have Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day. That was a coincidence of when they signed their Independence Day declaration. And before that comes Memorial Day, which Americans don't generally celebrate. And then this one, the 33rd day of the Omer, which I hope to have a little bit of time to explain to you as we go through each of these individually. This brings us to the third of our pilgrimage festivals, and that's Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. It is the terminus period of a 50-day count, 49, and it's the 50th day, that begins on the second day of Passover. Traditional Jews will, from the second night of Passover on, count every day in the evening and say literally this: today is the first day of the Omer. Today is the second day of the Omer. And they will do that until they get to the 50th day of the Omer, which way they don't count, which is Shavuot. More on it in a moment. And then we end our liturgical year, if we're counting it from Rosh Hashanah, with the other major fast day, also a commemoration, by the way, not a holiday per se. And that is called Tisha B'Av. And the name of it is simply the translation of its calendar date, the 9th of Av. All right, so I'm going to leave this up, and I'll try to remember to go to scroll. Maybe if I make it smaller, can you guys still read that? Or is that useless? It's readable? Okay. I'm just going to leave it up there. Let me see if I can just get a little bigger. I'm just going to leave it up there for your reference. There's, we're not going to talk about we're not going to talk about this too much, but I'd like you to have it just if you want to see it. You can see that okay, Arthur? Yes. Okay. All right. So let's go through these actual days and talk about what makes what a what. And we're going to start with fasts. Now, we're going to return to Yom Kippur in just a few minutes in more depth, but I do want to talk about different kinds of fasts. Jews do fast. Some ultra-Orthodox Jews fast a lot, and fast days have been proclaimed throughout Jewish history. But there are fasts and there are fasts, and most Orthodox Jews are beholden to 5. 2 of them are major, and 3 of them are minor. Doesn't mean that the minor are avoidable for them. The minor fast on a Jewish calendar is a daylight-only fast. A lot of people now understand that when the Muslims fast during Ramadan, they do eat during that month. They just don't eat during the daylight hours, which is why, of course, it's an easier fast when it's in the winter than the summer. But it's the same rule for our minor fasts. Jews can eat when it's dark, and so they can get up early and have breakfast, but they fast during the day, and they can eat late into the night before. You can eat yourself silly all night long. It's not like with Yom Kippur, because the night doesn't count. We have 3 minor fast days. It's not really that important for you guys to remember this. All 3 of them commemorate something that had to do with the period of the destruction of the temple. And that's all I'm going to say about them. The 2 major fast days, one of which is the 9th of Av and the other Yom Kippur that I'll address in a moment, because it's also a high holiday. These are the 25-hour fasts. And what do I mean by that? Well, you have to start them before sundown. So with sunset, you're done eating at sunset, when you would be lighting candles on a holiday, and you don't get to eat again until those 3 stars, or whatever time it says in your little guidebook, those 3 stars would theoretically appear. That comes to approximately 25 hours. That is a long fast. And because, particularly on the 9th of Av, you're doing it in the summertime, it means that sundown arrives very, very late. This can be in July, it can even be in early August, but no matter when it is, it's a long, long day and a shorter night, which doesn't change the fact that it's 25 hours. It just changes the fact that you're awake for more of those 25 hours. The 9th of Av is a day of mourning. Again, it's down here on our little calendar here. It's a day of mourning. It commemorates the destruction of both temples. Apparently, or supposedly, they both occurred on the 9th of Av. Realistically, they probably did happen right about then, based on external sources. And I will say this, many anti-Semites throughout history were well aware of the significance of this date and would attack Jews during this time. The expulsion from Spain took effect on the 9th day of Av. My ex-wife, her family was from a small village not too far from Vilna. The Nazis who were in charge there were very well aware, probably from informants, or maybe they just knew from some other source, that Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, was an important day of mourning. And the intelligentsia of that town, the rabbis and all of the leaders of the schools and so forth, they were taken out to a pit and killed on the evening of the 9th of Av. That's one of thousands of examples that I believe have been, or at least hundreds of examples that have been collected over the years. The most famous, of course, being the expulsion from Spain. It's not a day where you can avoid work, although people try to get, to do everything they can not to have to work that day. But it is a day when dirges are sung, when people essentially observe it as a fast from everything. Everything that you would normally abstain from on Yom Kippur, you abstain from on the 9th of Av. But unlike Yom Kippur, it's not a happy day. Yom Kippur is considered a joyous day. All right, so let's go forward in time to our major holidays. And let's start with these 2, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We do not entirely know their origin, but we believe that they started somewhere in Babylonian times, or at least were some kind of import from Mesopotamia. To go much further into that would be difficult. I did a whole lesson, a shiur, as we say in Hebrew, on Rosh Hashanah day, because we had the disadvantage of not having our services in person. So I did that as a Zoom thing, and we talked about it a bit. But it is really the day on which both the creation of the world is celebrated, again, a birthday, and also God's judgment period over the Jews begins. So while we can talk about Judaism being a culture, there are some, as much as a religion, there are some holidays that are more religious in that sense. And Rosh Hashanah is one of them, and Yom Kippur, which falls 10 days later, which, as you know, is a major fast day, so 25 hours, but it's considered a joyous fast, even though it can be a miserable time if you're fasting. These 2 days, it is very difficult to divorce from religion, because they seem to have started in religion, not necessarily Judahite or Israelite religion, but they were specifically about gods, and all of it was then turned around and made to be about Yahweh. On Rosh Hashanah, we've accrued lots of different traditions and symbols, the blowing of the shofar, which you're familiar with, reading the Torah, apples and honey or other sweet foods. Pomegranates were very popular in the Near East and have become much more well known as a symbol of the holiday now in America. I remember growing up, if somebody had asked me what a pomegranate has to do with Rosh Hashanah, I might not have had any familiarity with that. I'm sure many people did, but I didn't, and I'd never seen it in my Sunday school. But that's an example of how, with the growing diaspora, we've shared things. In Israel, it's a day of family getting together. They even give gifts, if I'm not mistaken. What is a more problematic day, if you're not religious, is Yom Kippur. Now, I love what secular humanistic Judaism did with it. It's one of the reasons I am a secular humanistic Jew, because I like religious Judaism, but I like it with non-theism. And secular humanistic Judaism can absolutely celebrate Yom Kippur, whether you fast or not, in a way with a complete integrity, by talking about the facets of it that are not about asking God for forgiveness, but the facets that were developed even in traditional Jewish culture over hundreds of years of asking each other for forgiveness. And so for me, that's a very big boon, because I think that it's good to have a day of introspection. It's good to have a period of time when you're thinking about what kind of person you are and how you want to behave. Yom Kippur has a lot of rituals, but they are almost all, with the exception of the fasting and things related to fasting, no sex, no baths, things like that. And there's much more that you would learn about that I don't have time for tonight. But most of those rituals are liturgical. They are how the prayer service is oriented. And there are a lot of prayer services on Yom Kippur. Jews can be in Yom Kippur all day long. Even my Reformed temple growing up, especially when I was a teenager and getting more into Judaism, even that one, we had services that went until 1 o'clock. We took a break and then got together again at 4 or 5 o'clock. And those services went as late as 7 o'clock or 7:30 or 8 o'clock. When I was a Hillel director and was in a much more traditional setting, the break wasn't even that long. Probably if there was any one holiday that makes me grateful to be a humanistic rabbi, just in terms of my job responsibilities, it's Yom Kippur. I was very, very good at chanting the entire service, the whole Torah portion and everything else. And I can still regale you with all of the, what they call piyutim, these medieval poems that were written all over the Jewish world, and various different kinds of tonal, repetitious chanting formulas, musical formulas that I learned over the years. It was a good thing too. I made a little dough doing that when I was a JCC guy, because there were congregations that needed it. But it also meant I was up on my feet the entire day. And I will be honest, because this is the crowd I can be honest with. They always had, wherever I did this, some kind of little room that the rabbi could sit in. And there was always water, an apple, something in there for me. And I wasn't ashamed of it, because I would have just fallen over. There were a few rabbis who had to do everything by themselves. But Yom Kippur is there, very important on our calendar. And that is basically it for the Yamim Noraim, except to say this, that Yom Kippur is a very good example of the adaptation of what used to be highly animal sacrifice based, entirely almost, which is what took place in the temple. And if you ever go to a traditional service, and even the Reform movement's been doing it for a good 20 plus years now, maybe 30, you will hear at some point in the day a complete dramatic reconstruction of the animal sacrifice service. It is right there in the poetry. Secular humanistic Jews don't do it. Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews, they tend to chant it. The Reform Jews actually have made it into like a little play. It's really interesting, but there it is. And that's really because the whole holiday surrounded putting your sins on these animals and then sacrificing those animals to attain purification. All right, so much for the high holidays, which are the most experienced. Let's move down and let's talk about pilgrimage holidays. So here's the first one, Sukkot. Here's the second one, Pesach. And here's the third one, Shavuot. Why pilgrimage? Pilgrimage, because this is when, in the days when the Israelites were primarily in their land, they were encouraged to go up to the temple in Jerusalem to make sacrifices. And all three of these have very significant sacrificial elements to them. But more importantly, they share something else in common. They are the three most ancient holidays on the Jewish calendar. And in fact, in at least two cases, they seem to be combinations of other things. They all, as ancient holidays, start out as agricultural festivals. And they map perfectly to the agricultural calendar of the land of Israel. I remember when I was, for the very first time in Israel on Sukkot, the weather literally changed that day. And it was just a coincidence because it usually doesn't happen perfectly like that. But it went from warm and sunny to cold and rainy instantly. Now, again, that's not the usual thing, but we do find in places like Israel and even to a certain extent where we live and in the Northern Hemisphere, that where Sukkot falls, you do begin to really feel fall coming on. In Israel, it's really more of the descent of winter-like conditions because Israeli winters don't tend to be harsh, although Israel has a lot of microclimates and you can have very, very big differences between, say, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, not to mention going further south or going further north. But what you do have in Israel are a wet season, a wetter and colder season, and a drier and hotter season, sometimes boilingly hotter season. And this is when the wetter and colder season starts. So this is the season of both reaping the summer crop, getting it out of the ground now, and for some, depending on the crop, planting for the spring crop later on. Sukkot is celebrated also as a historical holiday. So what do I mean by that? All three of these pilgrimage holidays took on a legend of something that happened to the Jews in the Torah. They all bear the weight not only of their original or agricultural purpose, but they get a story too. Two of these have their stories deeply implanted in the Torah, and one of them, Shavuot, the rabbis came up with the Torah, with the story later. They said, oh, that has to be the date that happened. I'll talk about it in a minute. So what was Sukkot's story? Sukkot's story was that these booths, these temporary huts in which Jews dwell, which usually means eat, but some people do sleep in them. It depends on where you live. That these huts were the huts that they lived in during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And it says that in the Torah. But archaeological evidence and other kinds of extra biblical evidence demonstrates that these booths probably originated as harvest guarding booths. That when your crops came to fruition, you needed to be out in the field keeping an eye on them, and that you would have done so in these booths. The booths are still the most visible reminder of this holiday. And depending on where you live, you might live in a place where you see a lot or just some of them, or none. Even here in Detroit, there are neighborhoods or areas that you can go and see them outside office buildings, certainly synagogues and neighborhoods and the people's front yards, backyards. The holiday, like many Jewish holidays, like one other Jewish holiday, goes on for several days. And like several of these holidays, and particularly these three, they have, under certain circumstances, a day added to them. The reason for the day being added is so complicated that it would take me another 10 minutes of your time to explain it. So I'm just going to put it this way. For certain holidays, there was a sense of lack of sureness of when they should take place if you didn't live in Israel. In Israel, you knew because the witnesses of the new moon, remember I mentioned it earlier, the new moon, they would send out through shofar blasts and their own eyewitness, the moon is new, we're starting the month today, it's Rosh Chodesh, that new moon holiday. But the message would get out to the rest of Israel, meaning the Jews, in far-flung places in the diaspora, sometimes a day late. And because of this, some holidays had an extra day added to them. Chanukah is not one of them. And by the way, though Rosh Hashanah is observed as 2 days by some Jews, most Jews now, and only one day by a few Jews, it's also not one of them. It has a different reason, related but different. It really applies to Sukkot. Which turns a 7/8 day holiday into an 8/9 day holiday. It applies to Passover, which is easier. It goes from a 7-day holiday to an 8-day holiday, and to Shavuot, which goes from a 1-day holiday to a 2-day holiday. Now you're saying to yourself, well, Passover is already 7 days. Sukkot is already 7/8 days. Not only does it add a day, but it makes each of the holier of the days double. So I have debated with myself every time I've taught this, how much into the weeds I want to go with you on this. And I decided I'm not getting in the weeds with you at all. I'm going to say 2 sentences, and if you understand them, great. And if you don't, there's plenty of places to research it. Here are those sentences. Sukkot is a 7-day holiday. When you live outside of the land of Israel, ostensibly, although the Reform changed this too, it's supposed to become an 8-day holiday. Well, there's already one holy day at the beginning, these middle days, and this 8th day was already a separate holiday. So the 8th day special holiday gets doubled into a 9th day holiday. That 9th day, 1,500 years ago, gets corresponded to the Torah reading cycle, and it becomes yet a 3rd holiday. Simchat Torah. The first holiday, the first day of the cycle, becomes not 1, but 2 extra holidays. You see why I decided not to spend a lot of time on this. Passover, though, a little easier to explain. You have 7 days. The first is holy, the 7th is holy. And the middle are what we call the non-holy period of the holy day. And then when you add your day, you turn the first one into 2 holy days, the 7th into a 7th and 8th. And here's the part you might recognize. The first Seder allows the addition of a 2nd Seder. That's as close as our congregation and movement actually gets to observing this, because we do have a Seder on the 2nd night in many of our congregations, but that's really just to take advantage of the fact that people know it culturally. Sukkot also includes that beautiful lulav, you know, the different species. There's willows and sprigs of myrtle, and also the palm branch in it, and the very expensive lemon, which is really a citron, which costs ungodly amounts of dollars, and it's waved around, and people will march around it in the synagogue. And there's yet another holy thing that I didn't even mention to you. Look it up. Sukkot is fascinating. There's at least 4 other traditions that we don't even have anymore because the temple is gone or because they disappeared. And I will say I spent a little time on Sukkot because the rabbis had a name for Sukkot too. They called it the holiday, meaning the holiday par excellence. It was the biggest celebration, all out fun holiday that they had on their calendar at that time. And that's the reason for it. All right, moving along, we get to Chanukah. Not going to give you a big giant lesson in Chanukah, except to remind you that you can read about it in the various documents of humanistic Judaism, or just go and look for the true history of Chanukah. It's very new. It's 2,160 years old, give or take. We know, or 2,180, I suppose now. We know that because we know what happened. It was a civil war between Jews. One group of Jews, the Hellenists, imposing lots of things that were not acceptable to the more traditional. But one of the things that they did impose was the celebration of a Greek solstice festival. That part stuck. That's why I celebrate it. The Maccabees were Taliban. That's all I'm going to say about it. but it is considered a minor holiday. There are no work restrictions. The pilgrimage holidays, I failed to mention, have all of the features of Shabbat in terms of their restrictions, unless they don't, when they don't fall, when they don't fall on Shabbat, what they have instead, sorry about that, what they have instead is you can do, you're restricted in every way, but you can still cook. So that's one little difference. On Yom Kippur, it's always a big Shabbat because you're not allowed to cook because you're not allowed to eat. Okay, moving along to what just happened here. Can you still see my thing? Okay, moving along. All right, in a few weeks, we're going to celebrate a commemoration called Tu B'Shvat, the 15th day of Shvat. It has become associated with, in people's minds, as the birthday of the trees. It is a tax day for tithing. It is nothing more than that. But it did grow over time into being a favorite of the mystics who saw in it harbingers of spring. Maybe they knew the vaccine was coming, I don't know, but they got a little bit giddy at the end of January in that period. And so we have that. We then move on to the next one, Purim. Purim is a feast of spring, not unlike Mardi Gras. It has its roots in pagan spring festivals. The story of Esther may have been written specifically for a pre-existing holiday. We don't know, but that's a good guess. It is the only holiday whose events are celebrated, in which the events took place entirely outside of Israel. So that's one of its distinctions. It is a day to celebrate this weird, wonderful, hysterical satire of a story that some Jews, God bless them, think is true, that tells about this Jewish queen living in this Persian palace and all of the shenanigans that go along with her saving her people from the one serious part of the story, the near destruction at the hands of a Hitler-like character named Haman, with whom Hitler has been associated. Haman also associated with even more ancient enemies of the Jewish people or of the Israelites in the Torah, Amalek, if you know that name. So Purim, this feast of lots, is just a wonderful day to go crazy. It actually has 2 days too, but only in Israel. If you live inside of Jerusalem, it's supposed to be, it's a day after where it is everywhere else. It has to do with some legend about walled cities. But in Israel, this is really a wonderful day. It's one of the few holidays, Hanukkah being the other one, where people just really party a lot. But the partying on Purim dwarfs anything that Hanukkah could have to offer in Israel. And of course, people wear costumes and alcohol is celebrated. It's even mentioned in the Talmud, go ahead and get drunk. And gives you all the reasons to. People go crazy, and we have in the West little Purim spiels, plays, and in Israel they actually have parades. And that brings us 1 month later to our second, or first, if you're counting from when the first month is, pilgrimage holiday, and this one is Passover, which was originally, we believe, 2 holidays. One that may have been a vegetable, meaning wheat, sacrifice ceremony, Chag HaMatzot, the holiday of the dried or the unleavened bread, and Chag HaPasach, the holiday of the sacrificial lamb. And the two seem to have been joined together at one point, strictly agricultural. But just as the Torah did to Sukkot, they gave it a story. And the story is the story that you know very well, and I don't need to go into it. You most likely have been to Seders, and you know what goes on there, the retelling of it. And yes, humanistic Jews do it. It's one of the most asked questions I have. Yom Kippur, I think, actually gets edged out by this. Well, if you don't believe there was an Exodus, why do you celebrate Passover? And my snotty answer is, your rabbis don't believe there was an Exodus either. And I know that they don't in most cases, because I went to the same damn rabbinical schools that they went to. So I know what they believe and don't believe. The Orthodox, well, you'd have to ask them individually. I'm sure 99% of them do believe, but I know quite a few, because those are the ones I tend to know, who don't believe that happened either, because it's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of evidence. But what's important for us in just understanding how the laws work is to talk next about this Omer period. Here is a really interesting example of how things evolve. The Omer period, which simply says this 50-day countdown from Passover to what turns out to be Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks. That's why they call it weeks, because it's 7 weeks and then bingo, bango, there it is. By the way, the Christians have a version of this because it's something that happened in their Bible on that day that they call Pentecost, right? You've heard of that one. Jews do not call this Pentecost, although I tell you, you could sometimes find a few old Jewish Bibles from like the 1940s and 50s, and you will see that word in there, which is really disconcerting. This Omer period was really about counting down to the late spring harvest. There's another harvest, a fruit harvest in Israel in the late spring. But like a lot of things, history gets in the way. And it turns out that during the period of the second big revolt of the Jews, after the destruction of the temple in the 120s, 130s CE, so that's not even 2,000 years ago, lots of bad stuff went down during this period for the Jews. And particularly during the first 33 days, there were slaughters. And this was historically recorded by not just Jews, but by outside sources, slaughters of rabbis, slaughters of community leaders. The war that we're talking about came to be known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. And I did mention it when we went through history. It was really an enormous disaster of Holocaust proportions for the Jews. There are some, and we don't have reliable numbers, but there are some serious historians who believe that as many as 1 million Jews may have been caught up in this and killed. Many in Israel, most in Israel, not entirely. And so this period then became a period of mourning. So during the Omer period, you're not supposed to do certain things like go to public entertainment, go to the plays, go to this kind of thing, go to concerts. I have family members who, that could be devastating if a certain artist they wanted to see was playing. But then the modern state of Israel comes along. And through no fault of its own, you can blame Israel for a lot of things, but it ain't Israel's fault that the British decided to pull out of Israel, having already been told they were to leave and that a state was going to be established for the Jews and another one for the Arabs, that they pulled out on what turned out to be a day right in the middle of Omer. And that made them happy because they had a new country. But how are you going to celebrate this new country if you're mourning the destruction of your people 1,800 years ago? It becomes a thing, and it is still political. The observance of the Israel Independence Day is to this day controversial both in Israel and America for religious, very Orthodox Jews. If you're a very Orthodox Zionist Jew, well, you temporarily suspend all the misery of the Omer. But if you're a ultra-Orthodox Jew who's not that jazzed by the state of Israel, you don't do that. You say it's still part of the day of mourning. And then everybody fights with each other. And I've even seen people fight with each other in the same synagogue about whether it's okay to say a psalm on that day, a psalm in praise of God that you're not otherwise allowed to say during the Omer. Talk about evolution. As it turns out, Yom HaShoah, the day that the Israelis picked for Holocaust commemoration, was also controversial, but for other reasons. There were many who felt that that would be best observed on the 9th of Av, since we were already mourning everything else at that time. As it turns out, the world picked January for Holocaust Day. So we've got 3 of them, depending on what kind of Jewish outlook you have. In any case, due to a legend that I will not repeat because we don't have the time, on the 33rd day of that Omer period, the worst of the worst that the Romans could inflict upon the Jews in their land in the 130s BCE was a CE. This is what happens when it gets late. 130 CE was over. And so that 33rd day of Omer, which is called Lag BaOmer, again, just you can, in Hebrew, I think I explained this, you can use letters as numbers. I mean, we do this in English too sometimes, but it's very common in Hebrew. So a lamed is a 30, a gimel is a 3, 33. If you put them together and you shove a vowel under them, which is what Hebrew likes to do, you get a word that's not a word, it's just log, sort of how we got to 2 from the other one for 15th of Shvat. And you get Lag BaOmer, and that becomes a happy party day. A lot of mystical stuff going on there because one of the rabbis who was thought to be saved is attributed to him as the Zohar. He didn't write it. It's 1,200 years after he lived that it was written. But that becomes a day of creating bonfires. It's a wonderful night of air pollution in Israel, and particularly up in Sfat in the far north. And in Tiberias, where there are a lot of these rabbis' graves, people will go up there and make merry. And this then brings us, after we're counting down every single day, to day 50, which we don't count because that is Shavuot. Shavuot is the big sacrifice of the vegetables of the late spring harvest. I mentioned that the 3 pilgrimage holidays all got their own historical event shmushed on. Shavuot did, but it wasn't the Torah that shmushed it. It got appended, it received its appended historical event from the rabbis, who, with all kinds of mathematical gamesmanship, determined that if the Jews left Egypt on that first and second day, 49 days earlier, well, if we count in a certain kind of way, the 50th day is when they arrived at Sinai. And so the rabbi said, okay, Shavuot, you get a historical event too. It's when God gave the 10 commandments. This is a harder holiday for humanistic Jews because we're not agriculturalists. And so while we can certainly celebrate that, and we do to a certain extent, I have a Shavuot service, we do, it becomes difficult when we start talking about receiving the Torah at Sinai. The Reform and Conservative movements, well, it was the Reform movement that invented it. They came up with something very clever to keep people celebrating Shavuot when no one else wanted to, because it is the most boring day. Its entire tradition consists of eating dairy food because it's like the Torah's milk of Israel is one reason for it. And they invented a ceremony for their high school kids called confirmation, which is the most Catholic sounding thing you could come up with, but fit right in with the 19th century Reform Jews who really just loved words. They probably called Shavuot Pentecost. I know they put it in their books. I don't know if any of them ever said it, but they put it in their books. The other thing about Shavuot is that it had to it its own little mystical tradition that became popular recently in Israel in the last 30 years, in America just in the last 5-10 years. And this is the idea that you stay up all night and study Torah or something. In Israel, depending on the city you live in, this is an amazing thing because every cultural center, every religious institution gets in on this unplanned, completely, I mean, they each plan their own, but this completely spontaneous seeming all-night cultural, artistic, Torah, religious, not religious, everybody's doing something all night long. Now it's caught on in New York. It's caught on in Los Angeles, I believe in Chicago. And this year, for the very first time, Humanistic Judaism did our own version of this. It's called the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, the Tikkun meaning the correction for the night of Shavuot. What are we correcting? It's an ancient rabbinical tale that says the Jews were supposed to be staying up all night, excited to get their damn Torah, and some of them fell asleep. So to correct that, they stay up all night. We still use the word tikkun because we haven't come up with any better as humanistic Jews. And we just started doing this year. And we started doing it because of the pandemic. Because Zoom made it possible for us to offer 4, 5, 6 hours, we didn't go all night, of different kinds of programming. And it was really well received. And maybe we'll do it again in the future. But so Shavuot might be making a comeback. It could be making a comeback, but it will always be a little holiday. And that's pretty much it until we get to the middle of the summer when a minor fast introduces 3 weeks of misery, which culminates on the 9th of Av, which I've already described to you. But one little coda, a tiny little nothing day mentioned in the Talmud, the 15th day of the month of Av, so 6 days later, is the Jewish Valentine's Day. It's called Tu B'Av. And that one has started to make a comeback too, primarily because in Israel, where they also seem to celebrate Valentine's Day, at least according to the Chazarai that's available at the mall, they have figured out a way to repurpose the hearts and flowers and candy for an extra Valentine's Day called Tu B'Av in the summertime after Tisha B'Av. And the entire understanding of it came from a Talmudic tale about how boys and girls were matched up on that day. It is a nice time of the year because it's before the month that precedes. It's after Tisha B'Av, and it's before the month that precedes Rosh Hashanah, which in and of itself is a heavy month, not just because you're writing sermons as a rabbi, but there's a lot of repentance going on. So that last little bit of Av becomes sort of a time of release, a time of love, a time of summer's last waning days, sort of how we might look at the period around Labor Day. And that's my journey around the Jewish calendar. I can't believe I got it in 1 hour and 20 minutes. So I know I always ask for questions and you guys generally don't have a lot, but I will, maybe I should check the chat. Oh my God, what a full chat. Yes. There's no question. Yes, Rachel, it is the absolutely the Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, is not a happy day for everyone, and there are more and more non-Zionist Jews. So where did the command for candles come from? We don't. It's not specifically a command. It's interesting how it comes to be. It's a rabbinical custom, a rabbinical command in that sense, but it's meant to bring light into the house before the Sabbath begins, because you can certainly allow, even the Karaites allowed fire to burn down. Let me see what else there here I could say. Rin was born on Shavuot. Happy Shavuot. Happy birthday every year. Yes, and I left out Shavuot, the flowers, and in Israel, the secular Jews did a lot on kibbutzim. Secular Jews in Israel still celebrate as if they were agricultural Jews in many cases. It's a great time to take your kids out into nature. And I know the kibbutzim make some dough on the festivals and things that they put on Shavuot, which at this point is more or less just a nostalgia thing, because there are very few Israelis that are engaged in agricultural, in picking the weeds themselves, and many kibbutzim have privatized and are doing other things now. And the people who do anything agricultural there are brought in from the outside, which is a whole different class.